they're talking about.
It's actually the other way around.
Well, yeah, they're religious, not spiritual. What they mean is they don't want anything to do with organized religion. So a disorganized religion would be okay. Or my own private religion that I put together for myself. That's right. That's what they want. Right. This is, but there's so much in the traditional way that Christianity has been promulgated that feeds into this. I mean, what was the salvation system offered by the medieval church? It was basically the healing of the soul, right? And it was moralistic, and it was individualistic, because even in the traditional Catholics, at least up until a few years ago, when you went to church, and this was certainly true in the Middle Ages, it wasn't a corporate experience. You each were individually going through your individual devotions as you heard Mass. And watched the priest. Right. And the same with Protestants. It was about the salvation of my soul. Stay out of politics. It's just about my soul here, you know? And so it's not just Catholics. And this isn't Christianity. Because Christianity, what is Christianity? Christianity is Levi dying and being thrust totally into existence, Jesus' own life in existence under the cross. It's dying and exhibiting the death of Jesus in your own life in the hope of the resurrection. It's quite different than the salvation of your soul. Right? Anyway, that's religion. It's individualistic, it's metaphysical. The God is the God out here, the God who's everything I'm not, and it's me and God. And my making contact and getting God's benefits for myself. Now, the world come of age lives without the religious God. What happens is that more and more we're able to manage our lives without looking out there for help from this God who's outside the world. As our knowledge and as our strength increase, the less we need God. So he was reading this book, Das Weltbild der Physik. He says, it has again brought home to me quite clearly that we shouldn't think of God as the stopgap, that's the Lückenbüsse, for the incompleteness of our knowledge, because then, as is objectively inevitable, when the boundaries of knowledge are pushed ever further, God too is pushed further away and thus is ever on the retreat. And that's been the history in the last 300 years. God gets pushed further and further away as the defenders of God give up more and more territory. So that the most offense and the greatest reason for not believing is because the so-called defenders of Christianity aren't defending very much at all. They've given it all up.
You have to take
So,
a stand like the Jews did and they were living in the forest. There was a movie about that. Can't think of the starts with a D, but anyway, they withstood, took a stand and survived in the woods, building huts and figuring out how to scavenge and survive. Defiant.
yeah, well, he's talking about what happened, what actually has happened. And so you have, in the 19th century, you had natural theology. William Paley, not William, it was Paley anyway, who wrote the book, the standard book that said, by looking at nature we can see the design, and therefore we know that there's a God, and to get more exact information, maybe or maybe not, we can go to the Bible, but mostly we know it from nature. And of course, that is the Christianity that Darwinism overthrew. Not what Bonhoeffer is talking about. But then that seemed to be the great defeat of Christianity, because they had to back up, then back up. A few people were defiant. Those were the fundamentalists. And they became isolated little kind of reactive communities within, and maybe not so little, but certainly backwater communities. But Bonhoeffer says it's not even just, these natural problems like how do I deal with illness and so on, but he said, this is true even for the ultimate questions of death, suffering, and guilt. Today, even for these questions, there are human answers that can completely disregard God. Human beings cope with these questions practically without God and have done so through the ages, and it is simply not true that only Christianity would have a solution to them. As for the idea of a solution, we would have to say that the Christian answers are just as uncompelling or just as compelling as other possible solutions. People get along quite well with, even apart from the gospel. That's what he's saying. And they deal with life's crises, they deal with death, they face death bravely, and they deal with guilt, they deal with meaning, the meaning of their life without the gospel. What do you think? Is this true? Can you think of examples?
Suicide rate in Japan is much higher than America because if they fail at financial success and shame their family, there's no sense of, there's no way out. They just shoot dishonor.
But he's talking about the West. So Japan would not really be part of this.
Well, we can look at Kubler-Ross's breakthrough on the stages of grief.
Yeah.
As dealing with the problem of death and dying in a psychological, secular way.
Right. Although she herself was terrified of dying and had a very bad death. But
As Becker points out, there is no solution for our ultimate fear of dying other than a Christian solution, and he was a secular Jew.
who said that?
Ernst Becker.
Oh, Ernst Becker. Well, this is controversial. I'm not saying that Bonhoeffer is right. I'm asking the question. Bonhoeffer was looking at, thinking about his colleagues in the conspiracy, many of whom were not Christian. They were kind of post-Christian, agnostic maybe,
They've grown up.
and they were stepping forward, taking risks, doing the deeds that needed to be done to make a future for Germany, with the full knowledge that they were risking their lives, and they were willing to do this without Christian faith.
Could one say that they've grown up in the remnant of Christendom?
Yeah.
I mean, would 3 generations later became Christianity in the West still produce that group of people today?
That's what Bonhoeffer thought when he was writing the Ethics. He kind of changed his mind as he went on.
During the First World War, that would have prepared the mindset of the people for the acceptance of Hitler and this great hero figure that he portrayed.
Well, no, I mean the shock of the defeat, which was totally unexpected by the German people, and could only be explained, they thought, by somebody had betrayed them, and that eventually they said it was the Jews among them that had betrayed them.
So they blamed it on the Jews.
They did.
I'm thinking from the standpoint of church, not
Friends,
just world happening.
A truce was drawn. Germany was ahead in the war, so was
Well,
He comes home, has a stroke, his wife runs the country for the last year, and it's all, the divination does nothing.
well, anyway,
What was happening to the faith
We're-
life in Germany?
well, we're getting off of our question here. I'm sorry. But the question before us is this true? Is this true that we are, that we live in an age in which people get along quite well
Yes,
without God?
yeah.
Yeah,
And one of the striking examples for me is how at the funeral homes,
right.
they no longer speak of funerals.
No,
Instead, they speak of celebrations of life.
right.
Yeah, that's stupid.
And that has become popular even amongst members of Christian churches.
Right.
Or even to the extent where some families don't have funerals at all.
Right.
They don't want the expense or whatever.
Right. Yep. They don't see the need. So, yeah, there's the question. We're offering something here that people don't need. Or are we?
I
If-
think they're called to the hospital for people that have no pastor,
I know,
and they don't want to face death alone.
yeah.
Have their family there, but they want,
When I was in Tacoma, I got calls quite often from people who were caring for their dying relative in hospice, and it was at the very last stages, and then somebody remembered, oh yeah, grandma, not mom here, but her mom, used to be a member of Emmanuel Lutheran Church. Maybe we should call the pastor. Well, it was way too late for me to have any interaction with the dying person. So they had no memory whatsoever of what a pastor would be called for. They had no clue. It was really frustrating. It happened to me more than once. And here is this family, and they're lovingly taking care of their loved one, bringing them all the way to the end, serving them, helping them through. And then there's this little remembrance. Oh, maybe we should have a pastor. But there's no reason why they really need a pastor. They don't know why they would need a pastor. They just thought it might be kind of nice to have one. Yeah, it wasn't for them. It was just a memory, So I would come, but I couldn't do anything with this person anymore. They weren't responsive anymore. So anyway, I think that all around us there are people that are living and getting along without what we have on offer, without what Bonhoeffer calls religion. Now, he's being very critical here. This isn't the gospel, but it's what we've confused with the gospel. We've said this is the gospel, and it isn't. And people don't want it anymore. And of course, ultimately for him, this is a hopeful development. So here he goes really even farther, and this is a little harder even to understand or to accept. We no longer break the first commandment by worshiping idols, because idols must be worshipped. Bonhoeffer says the truly new thing about the world come of age is that we no longer worship anything. So, well, listen to his. I'll read the paragraph here, and then we'll talk. We are now accustomed to saying our gods are money, sensuality, honor, other people, ourselves. It would be more accurate if we were to characterize power, success, the development of strength as our gods. But as a matter of fact, human beings in their weakness have always hung their hearts on all these things, and none of those things mentioned here is what the first commandment actually refers to when it speaks of other gods. For us, the world is stripped of idols. We no longer worship anything. We have experienced the fragility and futility of all things, all people, and ourselves too clearly to be able still to deify them. Our very being has gone too far off track still to be capable of having idols and worshiping them. If we still have an idol, it is perhaps nothingness, extinction, meaninglessness. What do you think of that? Yeah, yeah.
That's one thing, but then I also was thinking of one of my sister-in-laws who died several years ago, suddenly dropped dead in the bathtub, and in the shower. And when I tried to speak to her of Christ and church and so forth, she was a former science teacher and biology teacher, and she said, live life while you can, because when you die, you're done.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning
Right, right. Meaningless.
extinction.
Extinction.
So I don't know whether she had a sudden thing at the very end or not, but God.
Yeah. That's really something to ponder, isn't it? Because, Luther in his explanation of the first commandment in the large catechism talks about how we do have to hang our heart on something. And whatever we look for all good is our idol. And perhaps it is true that, therefore, we simply are really, well, maybe worshiping that nothingness, that extinction, that worshiping death itself.
Well, doesn't Luther say that since we have the image of God impressed upon us, even though we also have the image of man, there is that desire as part of our creation to know our God. So even though society has, as it says here, society has stripped us of our idols, the soul is still searching.
Yeah, of course, Luther didn't live to see modernity. And it could be, and he said there is no society so wicked that it didn't worship somehow, someone, or some God, some form of worship. It has some form of worship. But we know societies that have no form of worship. And most basically, the West has no form of worship. I mean, millions and millions and millions of people have no form of worship.
So are they not searching for anything?
Maybe, maybe not.
Well, to a certain extent, atheism is a religion, and now the atheists are even trying to have what they call quote-unquote church, because they want potlucks and the fellowship and the things that people have at church. So they're starting to have services like we have church.
Mm-hmm.
But without the forgiveness of sins, it is meaningless and painful. There is never any forgiveness. All the burdens of every day just keep piling higher and higher and higher.
Yeah, but people cope with it. People live with a certain kind of serenity, even apart from the gospel. I mean, people are all over the place, obviously, but you can see people that seem to be worshiping death itself. I mean, you see some young people, and you see the kind of tattoos they put on themselves, and the way they live and dress, and what's on their T-shirts. I mean, but most ordinary people are, I don't know. What do you think? That we are the first people. I mean, we modern, postmodern people, everybody always had something above. We don't really believe there's anything above us.
No, it's an American phenomenon, but Mormonism has become quite a phenomenon. And
Well, it's not just America. I mean, he's talking about the West,
yeah.
where modernity comes. We really don't believe. I mean, ancient people always believed there were gods, ancestors, something, spirits. Our predecessors always believed, that there was God there, and there would be a judgment, and that God was there, and some higher power, and they really believed it. And we're different because we don't really believe it. Yeah, but probably have the answer that Dorothy's sister had, you know, that's it.
Well, that's just
the
the
end.
mold they built around themselves.
Maybe.
That doesn't mean the image of God has been erased from their life.
No, I'm not saying the image of God is erased. That would be a big theological thing, and we have to define what image of God is. But are you talking in Augustinian terms now, that my soul is restless until it rests in you? Is that what you're talking about, Michael?
I have no idea. I'm just making stuff up.
In other words, we have a yearning for God somehow, however inchoate.
But yeah, it's part of our creation to have a yearning for God.
We see more Wiccans in the military, and we're seeing a lot of growth of Mormonism, so it seems like there's a group of young adults that are very, very interested in having something to worship.
Well,
I don't think that either of those two things have to do with worship very much.
I don't think it's to do with honest worship or real worship, but I think they're searching, you're saying they are searching for something.
Yes, but when you choose this God for yourself, you're not really below him, are you? You're always the decider about who's going to be your
I
God.
would agree with you on that. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
well, at some point, most everybody has within them the question, why live? What's life all about?
Young men.
And they have to answer that for themselves somehow or other, whether they are
Mhm.
led to the Lord, to look to him, or whether they,
I think a lot of people never face that question.
right.
And some do, and they answer it and say, well, I'm going to, like your sister did, this is it. I'm going to live life to the fullest and
Now live to the fullest.
live to the fullest, and then when I'm dead, that's the end of it.
Well, I question whether or not that they face the question. It's how they answer it. Do they have an agnostic, I gotta learn more, or do they simply say, yes, I have the question, but it's not important to them?
Right, maybe. I don't know. Each individual is different, I'm sure. But can we acknowledge that there is some truth here, that we have reached the point where we're not even idolaters anymore? We don't rise to the point of even violating the first commandment by worshiping false gods. We don't worship any gods whatsoever.
But see, we're looking at it from an American standpoint of the freedom from religion.
Yeah.
That this is a freedom that we have to express to keep ourselves away from that evil thing called faith. I mean, I think that's probably uniquely American, isn't it?
No,
Do Europeans think the same way?
Oh yeah. In fact, they're more. We're going to get to just hold that question, because he's going to talk about America after a while here. So we'll get to that in a little while. But we're at 5 o'clock. Can we, let's see. Let's get through that, okay?
Yeah, let's get through this.
Yeah, let's go. We just have that little section on America, which is right coming up here. Bonhoeffer believed that this is true in the West, even in the United States. He had some experience of the United States, which seemed so very religious and even Christian. He said the root of godlessness on the continent is a misunderstood distinction between the spiritual and temporal offices, between the two kingdoms. Remember, separating them out. But in Anglo-Saxon lines, especially in the United States, the root is the opposite, an insufficient distinction between the two arising from spiritual enthusiasm. So trying to be the city on the hill, trying to construct the kingdom of God here on earth. The claim that the church is building up the world on Christian principles leads to the complete collapse of the church into the world. Now, there is no radical enmity toward the church, at least in his stage when he observed the U.S., because the distinction between church and world was never distinctly made in the first place. Thus, he said, the godlessness remains concealed. But this also means, however, that the blessings of suffering and of the rebirth that might follow from it are withdrawn from the world. That is, from American world, the American world. In other words, he says in his diagnosis of Protestantism in this country that the predecessors, people who came to this country, did so, they fled in order to avoid persecution, in order to avoid suffering for the faith. And therefore, that possibility was closed to them. And he felt that this country was just as secular, maybe even more secular than Europe was. Europe was, the secularity there is characterized by hostile, anti-clericalism and open hostility to the church. Whereas that hostility wasn't so open here, he thought.
But my understanding was that his 2 visits to the United States, he saw American Christianity as being immature, and there wasn't any kind of substance in the theology.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. He was very impressed by the social engagement of Christians, but he saw that as being very shallow, just mere social engagement, and he called it Protestantism without Reformation. In other words, we lost the tension. The tension never was there in the first place. We were conflating the two all the time, going back to New England and the Puritans. So the tension is gone, and that means that we end up with a radical kind of freedom that was, you were talking about, Michael, earlier, the freedom from emancipation, freedom as sheer emancipation. That's certainly an element of American life, isn't it? From the cowboy hero, the lone cowboy, the lone individual who's the hero making the difference, but is never really integrated into the community. So what he's saying here is, his diagnosis of American Protestantism is that it's just hidden. We're just as nihilistic as the Europeans. It's just hidden. It's more hidden here because the distinction was, because there isn't so much overt hostility toward the church, although there is probably more now than there was when he was here in the 1930s.
Could part of his problem be, by being a Midwesterner, that he was in New York and he drove around and saw some things,
Yeah.
through. But he never, like Sasa spent a year at Wartburg in Dubuque. He didn't spend a year with Lutherans. He
No.
sort of came in full. I understand completely. He was beside himself because of what was going on in Germany and he had to get back. But he didn't really have a year abroad embedded in a community to get a handle on what a Lutheran experience would be, or even whatever. He was in a very strange place and visiting,
Well, he was in the center of where everything was happening. I mean, he met everybody of importance when he was there, and he was embedded in African American Christianity. He was a Sunday school teacher at the Abyssinian Baptist Church.
I know that, but he was in New York. What I'm saying is New
Yeah.
York and LA are very different
Yeah.
from the rest of the country, particularly back then. Bostic was like 50 years ahead of anybody in terms of being weird and what he preached about, his building and everything.
Well, he didn't have any extended experience with American Lutheranism. That's true. But I doubt that he would have been very impressed. But
I think that
know.
his intellectual and social standing in Germany, Andy, you mentioned this in class, he wasn't interested in going to St. Louis.
no,
And he wasn't interested in finding out what a faith was like, he wanted to see who he thought was interesting, and that was in New York.
Yeah. And he was very young, and he was interested in what was going on intellectually.
Where was Union Seminary? Where were they at as far as, obviously they weren't as, they would have been more of a Reformed seminary?
They were Reformed, liberal Protestantism, very liberal.
Okay,
So
so,
that-
on the landscape of today, are they the ELCA of today? I mean, I can't imagine what he saw then, coming from.
They weren't that bad yet.
No, they weren't. They weren't there. No.
John's grandfather went to UW.
It was the classic late 19th, early 20th century liberal Protestantism. So it was growing right out of evangelical Protestantism in America in the 19th century, which was always reformist, and especially out of the postmillennialism, the idea of, through evangelizing and through our reform of society, we're bringing in the millennium and finally the coming of Christ. So that stream, eventually evolved into, and the social gospel, from Rauschenbusch and the German Baptists and so on. All of those things were entering into what was at Union Seminary. There was Reinhold Niebuhr was the star there by that time, just starting to be the star in 1930, 31. William Sloane Coffin, all sorts of people that were they were highly regarded in the center of society. They were influential people in public life, and so that would be quite a different environment than, say, an ELCA bishop or a member of an ELCA seminary now who would have absolutely no standing, or even anybody at Union Seminary anymore. They're completely sidelined now. But they were pretty central to American life. They were quite influential. Niebuhr was one of the last of those that maintained that status until he died in the 70s. So, well, okay, let's quit. Do we have anything now?
Well, we would normally have something like sort of vespers, how about if we have, we do a song and have a closing prayer? Or- Sure. John is still teaching, we'll do that, and